Our gospel reading for this morning comes from Mark's gospel. Mark's gospel is probably the least friendly to the disciples, often portraying them as dolts and knuckleheads, and today is no exception. It is getting late in Jesus' ministry in the Gospel of Mark, but the disciples still struggle to get it. Listen for what the Spirit would speak to us through these words. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to Jesus and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but is for those for whom it has been prepared." And when the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and the great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must become your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I've been reading a new book by Mary Ann McKibben Dana, who's the pastor at Idlewood Presbyterian Church just west of here. It's entitled "Sabbath in the Suburbs, A Family's Experiment with Holy Time." And if you've ever thought about Sabbath keeping or just thought about how life is too busy and distracted, I highly recommend it. Mary Ann has young children, and in the book she talks of attending a parenting workshop where the leader asked the participants to share their hopes and goals for their children, to say where they hoped they might be when they were age 21. And she writes, "It was a heartwarming experience to imagine our children ready to be launched, all full of glowing potential, without the messy inconvenience of reality mucking up the fantasy. That my list was filled with lofty goals, that they would understand their strengths and limitations, that they would have a spirit of service towards others, and so forth." Later, I asked Robert, that's her husband, what he wished for our children, what success would be at age 21, and he said without hesitation, their own apartment. And she continues in the book, "After writing our list, the participants shared them with one another and basked in the radiance of all those self-actualized Eagle Scouts and lacrosse captains, confident yet humble. They were like young adult ghosts beaming around us. Then the leader said something that made them all disappear. Poof. 'These lists are for you,' she said. You want children with a spirit of service, a sense of the holy, an openness and curiosity to the world, Cultivate those things in yourself. Let them see you do it. Become the person and the parent you want to be. It is one of the most important gifts you can give to your children. The book goes on to say that if we want our children to have a different sense of time than most of the world has, to have some sense of Sabbath or holy time, we will need to practice that ourselves. And the point is easily expanded. If we want our children to be generous, then be truly generous yourself. If you want your child to have compassion and concern for others, have compassion and concern for others yourself. If you want your child to have somewhat different priorities, to adopt the priorities of Jesus over the priorities of the world, adopt those priorities yourself. Jesus is pretty clear that following him does mean adopting a different set of priorities. Jesus says that we are to love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and being, and to love others as ourselves. And I think that a lot of Jesus' teaching simply fleshes this out, explains what it looks like in various settings and contexts. And I think that's true of today's lesson. Although they've been with Jesus for quite some time, the disciples still seem to be caught up in the patterns of the world. They recognize that Jesus is the real deal, but they try to shoehorn that into the ways of the world. You can see that in James and John. They act just like a career counselor would tell you to do. Use your contacts to get ahead. And so when they get a moment alone with Jesus, they make their move. Rabbi, let us be your right and left-hand men when you take over. Jesus shuts them down. But the other disciples find out, and they're not real happy. Now, whether this is because they think the Zebedee brothers have done something unethical or they're just mad because they got beat to the punch, I don't really know. But they are upset, and they're ready to let James and John have it. But Jesus shuts them all down, saying, you know that in the world everybody wants to have power. They want to be in charge so they can tell other people what to do. But it is not so among you. It is not so among you. Actually, it seems that it is so based on the disciples' behavior. But Jesus says that they cannot remain this way. Greatness in this new realm that he brings means becoming a servant, a slave. Think about that. Being a slave means putting someone else's needs and desires ahead of your own. And Jesus says that's what it looks like to be important, big, great in this new thing that he is doing, something rooted in his own life of service and self-giving. Now, as you've probably recognized by now, we are marking in today's worship Children's Sabbath. This is an interfaith project of the Children's Defense Fund, something created, and this is their own words, to celebrate children as sacred gifts of the divine and to help houses of worship renew and live out their moral responsibility to protect, advocate, and care for all children. Now, children certainly need our help. Across the globe, children face war, ethnic and religious persecutions, famines, Many of us have followed the stories of a young Pakistani girl shot by the Taliban simply because she wanted an education and encouraged other girls to seek one too. And in our own country, more and more children are threatened by poverty and by an educational system that is failing them. And all of these are problems that we should be worried about and concerned about. For the most part, however, these are not our children's problems. Most of our children worry more about getting into the right college, making the team, dealing with stress or overly busy schedules than they worry about finding food to eat or having a place to lay their heads. But that does not mean that our children do not face threats of their own when it comes to living the life God dreams for them. The world that shapes and forms our children does not equate being a servant with getting to the top. No, having people serve you is what getting to the top is about in the world. But Jesus says, it is not so among you. Our culture works relentlessly to shape young people into consumers, people who view life as one of constant acquisition in order that they might serve and meet their wants and their needs. But Jesus says, it is not so among you. But it is so. It is so for our children because it is so for us. We may wish for them a less hectic and better balanced life. We may hope for them a gentler world with more room for caring and compassion, with more time for simply being rather than doing. But we struggle to show them this possibility because we are captive to the ways of the world. Even as we hear Jesus saying, it is not so among you. Even as we often wish it were not so for us. When we began thinking about the stewardship campaign for this year, I very much wanted us to move away from fundraising and to address this spiritual problem that afflicts us and that we pass on to our children. That's how we ended up with the Grow One campaign, which asks you to look at your giving as a percentage of your income and compare that with the tithe. The notion of giving the first tenth to God. Now, I don't know that there's anything magic about 10%, even if it is biblical. But it is a modest percentage. And the wide gulf between the typical church giver and the tithe is a pretty good measure of our captivity to the very non-servant ways of the world. The figures that I have seen suggest that the typical Protestant church member gives 2 to 2.5% of their income. And that follows a slow but steady decline from the Great Depression times. It's strange that we gave the most when we had the least. When America entered into a time of great prosperity in the mid-1950s, giving began to go down. And as we've gotten wealthier and acquired more and more things, our giving continues to go down. The world tightens its grip even as Jesus continues to say, "It is not so among you." To grow one, to move from giving 2% of your income to giving 3%, from giving 4 to 5, from 1 to 2, from 6 to 7, simply to begin pledging, is a small act of spiritual rebellion. It is a step away from our and our children's captivity to the ways of the world. It is a small but very real step toward new life and new freedom in Christ. Not that the world will grant us this freedom easily. It calls us back. You can't live without this. You'll never be happy without that. Freedom is about grabbing all you can get and not letting go of anything. It's about having others serve you. But in the midst of the world's loud clamoring, Jesus speaks softly and clearly. It is not so among you. All praise and glory to the God whose love comes to us and calls us to new life and new freedom in Jesus the Christ. Thanks be to God.